Good afternoon. Welcome to the Museum of the Albemarle for today's History for Lunch program. We're in a little bit of a different setting today. The auditorium was rented out for law enforcement training, which is why you saw all the police cars out front. But we appreciate your understanding, appreciate you coming out on this really dreary day. A couple quick things to mention. Please remember to mute your cell phones if you have them on you. And for those of you all on Zoom, please mute your microphone and use the chat for your questions. We'll have our Q&A session at the end as always. There are a few changes I want to note in the latest program calendar. So James Charlet's History for Lunch program about shipwreck rescues of the Outer Banks, that has been rescheduled to Wednesday, June 18th at noon. And so our next History for Lunch will still be on Wednesday, June 4th, but we'll have a new speaker. Ada Havel of Havel Research Associates will discuss Herbert Bamber, his camera, and his extraordinary life of service to the lighthouse establishment as he traveled America documenting lighthouses in the late 19th century. Hey, come on in. So we will have two History for Lunches in June, just a little bit different than what's in the program calendar. So we hope that y'all can join us for both of those. Now today we welcome author Bill Barber. He's going to discuss the independent seacoast companies who served along our coast, keeping the British at bay during the Revolution. So I'll turn the stage over to Mr. Barber.
Thank you. Thank you. When I first started doing research into the American Revolution, I probably knew as much as anybody else knew that you've been taught in high school. You knew about Lexington and Concord, the shot heard around the world, and you knew about the Battle of Bunker Hill and the hard, cold winter at Valley Forge and the surrender of Cornwallis at Yorktown. That was pretty much my exposure to the American Revolution. Everything just seemed so far away and that really nothing happened here in the Albemarle area. It was all somewhere else. But when I started doing research in preparation for the 250th celebration, which is coming up next year, I started looking into some of the veterans, some of the people from this area that might have served in either the Continental Line or in the militia. And I found a bunch of people. There was a lot of people that served during the American Revolution. And part of what I also found was some of these guys that served in this thing called the Independent Seacoast Company. And that really got my curiosity up. So I started trying to figure out what that was all about. And it was only one part of our Revolutionary War heritage. There's a lot of other things happening, but I think the Independent Seacoast Companies did a great job, or certainly had a significant role in limiting the loss of property and shipping and even lives here in the Albemarle area from British invasion through our inlets and by land. Just to give you a brief kind of prepare you for some of the things we're going to be talking about, the basic military organizations of the American Army during the Revolutionary War was first the militia. Now, the militia was an English organization that they had all of their colonies pretty much do. It provided that the local colonies could train their people to provide for some defense. And it had prevented the king from having to spend a lot of money in garrisoning English troops here in the colonies. So the militia was basically a group. If you were between the ages of 16 and 60, you were in the militia. And it was your job to provide for. They would train 3 or 4 times a year. I don't know how much actual training they get. It seemed like they had some pretty good parties whenever they got together. But anyway, that was their role, was to provide for defense of the colony. And it was part of the British Empire. They usually only served for 3 months. These were local people that were farmers and shopkeepers, and so they really couldn't afford to be gone very long. So if you were enlisted or if you were volunteered into the militia for active service, it was generally for about a 3-month period of time. You couldn't afford to be away from your family. If you were a farmer and you had livestock and crops and all that's tin. I mean, that was all done by hand. You just couldn't afford to be away. So the militia was usually limited to about 3-month service. If they needed you longer and the governor called you up, you could be put into what was called state's troops. Militia normally served within the county that you lived in, or at least within the military district that you lived in. You didn't go far from home. But if the governor saw a need, the governor could call up, the governor was the commander-in-chief of the militia, so the governor could call up what was called state's troops, and you could serve up to 6 months, and you could serve anywhere in the state of North Carolina, or the governor could order you to go outside of North Carolina and South Carolina and Virginia if it was needed there. So you had the militia, you had states troops, and then you had the Continental Line. The Continental Line was under the control of the commander-in-chief, George Washington. He was appointed on June 15th, 1775. It was voluntary enlistment in the Continental Line. George Washington saw that there was a need to have a more or less long-term commitment. And if you enlisted for 3 months as a militiaman and you had to go from here to Charlotte, for example, you spent most of your enlistment just getting there. Once you got there, you only was there for a while, then your enlistment ran out and you were discharged. So it was hard to move all these militia troops around the 13 colonies because they had such limited short enlistments. So when they first came up with the Continental Line, it was a 6-month enlistment, and that quickly changed. And then after that, it was 2 or 3 year enlistments. And then finally, you could sign up for the duration of the war. And so you basically were involved in the Continental Line. You could be stationed anywhere from Georgia to New York. You're under the command of General Washington. You're outside the control of North Carolina for the state government. And it basically was the predecessor to the United States Army. This was kind of the first step to establish a full-time regular army. So you got militia, states troops, and Continental Line. The story about the defense of the North Carolina coast really begins at Great Bridge. Lexington and Concord, which was on April 19th, 1775, by most historians is considered the beginning of the Revolutionary War. Historians now look at Great Bridge as being the Lexington and Concord of the South. It was a very significant battle close by. It's just across the line into former Norfolk County. It turned out to be a very significant battle in the beginning of North Carolina's role in the Revolutionary War. And it was at the Battle of Great Bridge that really alerts North Carolinian threat they had to be invaded by the British. In June, just to give you a brief overview of the battle, in June of 1775, Lord Dunmore fled the colonial capital of Williamsburg, Virginia. He goes aboard a ship in the Norfolk Harbor. In September 1775, the state of Virginia raises 2 militia regiments, which we would call states troops, and one was led by Patrick Henry, and the other one was led by Colonel Wolford. And Wolford is sent to Norfolk to prevent Dunmore from doing damage in the Norfolk area. The Princess Anne militia forms, and they're moving to meet Colonel Woodford to reinforce his 2nd militia. And they meet at a place called Kempsville. It was also referred to as Kemp's Landing. It's still called Kempsville today. And Dunmore and his British regulars soundly defeat Princess Anne militia. I mean, they drive them back. After that, Dunmore moves down to Great Bridge. They built a little ramshackle fort there at Great Bridge on the north side of the southern branch of Elizabeth River. The Norfolk County militia, as well as North Carolina militia, mostly Currituck men, have streamed up to reinforce it, and they've built some breastworks on the south side of the bridge. The Battle of Great Bridge takes place on December the 9th, 1775, and it's a resounding victory for the Patriots. The British are driven back to Norfolk, and then they have a siege at Norfolk where the town of Norfolk, the city of Norfolk, is burned. Dunmore retreats to his shipping, and he finally leaves the harbor. But there was a lot of concern by North Carolinians because of this move toward North Carolina. Norfolk ultimately was going to be a strategic point because it was kind of midway between Philadelphia and Charleston. And they figure sooner or later the British are going to establish a garrison there at Norfolk, or at least a seaport there. So North Carolina took some steps to try and blunt or try and interrupt any kind of invasion into North Carolina. And the concern was there was really no strategic reason for the British to invade northeastern North Carolina. There's nothing here that they needed other than food, for the troops, and they thought that the British troops would probably look at North Carolina as their breadbasket to feed their troops that would be stationed or garrisoned in Norfolk. So there was a real threat that they were going to come through and wreck a lot of farms, steal a lot of plunder a lot of private properties. So they established a militia garrison at a place called Edmonds Hill, which is up near Mount Pleasant Road in Great Bridge. North Carolina militiamen, principally from the Eaton Military District, from Currituck and other counties in the area, would be stationed at Edmonds Hill for the duration of the war. They were kind of the first line of detection if there was a British invasion coming from the north. And then the second place they would be at the Northwest Bridge. If you go down 168, you cross the Northwest River just before you get into North Carolina. They had established a small breastworks there at the old Northwest Bridge, and North Carolina militiamen stayed there for the entire war. And both of these two groups had a few minor skirmishes along the way, but they were kind of the advance guard to send the word if any of the British troops tried to enter into North Carolina. On the Fourth Provincial Congress, on April the 4th, 1776, at Halifax, that's when the Halifax Resolves were written, which basically authorized the North Carolina delegates at the Continental Congress in Philadelphia to vote for independence. And then on April the 15th, more demand for troops to sign up for the Continental Line. So field officers were appointed for the 3rd, 4th, and 5th regiments. So North Carolina now has 6 regiments within the Continental Line. And then a committee is appointed to take into consideration the defenseless state of the seacoast of this province. And this was what they were charged with, that the seacoast from the Virginia line to South Carolina is totally defenseless. There's people that live there, and the Outer Banks in that era was primarily used as kind of an open range. There was a lot of cattle, a lot of hogs, a lot of sheep. People grazed wild livestock up and down northern Outer Banks on a free range, so to speak. So that was their concern. And they also thought that if they could prevent the British from landing and taking these supplies, that it could shorten the war, that they could cut off their supply line a little bit, not let them venture into North Carolina and gain a lot of the goods that we had that might shorten the war. So this is what the Provincial Congress resolved after the committee reported, was that they would establish 5 independent companies. And the key here is the word independent. These would be companies that would be raised, that would be outside the scope of the local militia. These were going to be companies that would report directly to the Provincial Congress. They wouldn't report to the governor, they wouldn't report to anybody else. It'd be under their purview as to these 5 independent companies. What they really wanted to do was to ultimately have the Continental establishment, the Continental Army, take over these companies, and so that North Carolina wouldn't have to pay for them. I mean, we were broke; we were printing paper money that we didn't have nothing to back it. So they really wanted the Continental Line to take these seacoast companies over. And they said that the officers and the soldiers of said companies would be allowed the same pay and rations. So they were setting themselves up to where these guys eventually were going to the Continental establishment would take them and they just move over and become part of the Continental Line under George Washington. But they were going to have ultimate control, would be the Provincial Congress. And so these are the companies that they raised. The first is between Currituck Inlet and Roanoke Inlet, and that was under the command of Captain Dennis Doget. Now, that was his French name. His family, they were French Huguenots. That name quickly changes to Dozier. And so by the end of the war, everybody refers to he has a brother Peter as well. Both of them by the end of the war are referred to as Dennis and Peter Dozier, not Dozier. So that name changes very quickly. The second one was at Ocracoke Inlet. Ocracoke Inlet was a very important area because it was kind of North Carolina's main seaport into New Bern, to the Pamlico and the Albemarle Sounds. Dennis Dozier was from Currituck County. Captain James Anderson at Ocracoke Inlet was from Terrell County. The third was the between Ocracoke Inlet and White Oak Inlet, and that was Enoch Ward. Then between Bogue Inlet and New River Inlet, that was Captain Selby Harney. Now, Captain Selby Harney, if you're from Elizabeth City or Pasquotank County, you're familiar with the Harney name. He came here, I think in 1765, and he was a ship captain, a mariner, and lived in Camden County. So he was a local figure as well. So and then the last one was John King between New River and the Deep Inlet. So of the 5 independent seacoast companies, people from our area, Captain Dennis Dozier, Captain James Anderson, and Captain Selby Harney were leading those 3 of those 5 companies. Officers for the Currituck Banks, which is the Northern Outer Banks Independent Seacoast Company, was Captain Dennis Dozier. First lieutenant was John Jarvis. The second lieutenant was Alexander Whitehall, and the ensign was Butler Cowell. Of these men, John Jarvis ultimately becomes a captain in the Currituck militia, and Alexander Whitehall also becomes a captain in the Currituck County militia, and he's also for a brief period of time, is captain of the 1st North Carolina Regiment of Militia, which was raised by the governor to go to South Carolina, and he served a brief period. Yes, sir.
So these are infantry units, right? They don't have ships.
Well, they do. They will have ships. I mean, they have access to local boats. And I think most of these men were mounted. I don't think they were on foot. I think they rode up and down the Outer Banks on horseback, from what I understand, because they move pretty quickly. But there's some accounts that we'll get to in a few minutes of where they actually captured British vessels. So I think they had access. I don't think they were ships that were dedicated to them to use for their purpose, but I think they could commandeer ships whenever they needed them in order to take care of it. Captain Dennis Dozier, just to give you just a brief update on him, he was appointed lieutenant colonel of the Minutemen of Currituck County in September 75, just before the Battle of Great Bridge. He's at the Battle of Great Bridge, and the colonel of the Virginia 2nd, Colonel Woodford, on December the 2nd, he writes a letter to the Virginia Committee almost every day of what goes on. And when he arrives, he says, Colonel Dozier with several other gentlemen and 30 volunteers have been here several days. So Dozier saw the importance of blunting this British invasion into North Carolina. So he had already gotten there before Woodford, and they were actually building breastworks there across the bridge in order to stop the advance into North Carolina. And then on the 29th, he's appointed captain of the Independent Seacoast Company for the Currituck Banks. This is an incident that occurred at Ocracoke Inlet to give you some idea of kind of what they were dealing with. This was on April the 14th, 1775. The ship Polly, which is owned by Edenton merchants, James Buchanan, Archibald Campbell, and Silas Henry, enter Ocracoke Inlet. They're hailed by Captain John Goodrich Jr. He hails from the Chesapeake Bay area, but he was on lookout down at Ocracoke Inlet. He's a privateer, and Ocracoke Inlet at that point in time, early in the war, was his prime picking grounds because a lot of merchant vessels came through Ocracoke Inlet. Most of them were unarmed, and he was having a heyday there at Ocracoke. Goodrich seizes the Polly as a prize of the ship that came in from the Edenton owners. He takes that as a prize. That night, a ship from the Royal Navy, an armed sloop named the Fincastle came through the inlet and took possession of the Polly along with two other vessels that Goodrich had also taken. But on April 17th, 23 armed men from Ocracoke, led by, let me get his name right, Benjamin Bonner, in 5 whaleboats, attacked Goodrich, and they recaptured the Polly. They recaptured the armed tender, and Captain Selby Harney is said to have been in this boarding party that captured these vessels back. Goodrich was taken prisoner. The vessels they took back were taken to New Bern. Goodrich was taken prisoner and transported to Charlottesville, Virginia, where he was imprisoned for 18 months. Another incident that you read about is the skirmish at Roanoke Inlet. The Polly was an example of the naval engagements that some of these seacoast guys would go through, and the skirmish at Roanoke Inlet is kind of what the men on shore did. Roanoke Inlet is gone today; it's closed in, but it's just about where the next pier is, Whalebone Junction. Somewhere in that area was where the original Roanoke Inlet was. On August the 2nd, 1776, the Provincial Congress authorized 25 pounds of gunpowder to be withdrawn from the public armory in Edenton and given to Captain Dennis Dozier for use by the Outer Banks Seacoast Company. I think with Dozier, with his experience at Great Bridge, I think he was a man that meant business and he was going to do his job. So he got his powder from Edenton, and then 13 days later, he puts it to good use. What they typically did in those days, if those of you that have been to the beach, you're familiar with this kind of scene. In those early days of the war, British warships would come in on days when the tides were right and the winds were favorable. They would come in just as close as they could to the beach, cruise down the beach really slow until they saw this cattle, some kind of livestock. They'd drop anchor, they'd put a longboat over. Some Marines would come ashore, they'd slaughter the animals, carry it back to the ship because it's fresh meat. They were used to eating salt pork, salt beef, so it was a real treat to do that. Well, Captain Dozier knew what their routine was. He knew what they did. So I don't know whether he had a herd of cattle there waiting for him, or whether it was just by chance that he and his men were just kind of skulking along behind the dunes following this British ship. Dropped anchor, put over a longboat. There were 25 Marines and sailors in the longboat. They went ashore. When they got ashore and they got clear of the longboat, Dozier and his men fell plunged. They killed some, they captured the rest. I don't know the exact numbers, but it basically was the kind of activity that the independent seacoast companies were designed for, was to keep the British forces from invading into North Carolina. Just to show you some, I picked 5 veterans of the many that I found, and I just wanted to show you briefly that these guys are not only dedicated to the independent seacoast companies, but these guys served all over the South and even into the North. I mean, some of these guys enlisted 3 and 4 times. And so I just wanted to give you a brief taste of what it was like for some of these guys and the service they did. Caleb Mason was born in Currituck County on February the 15th, 1754. He enlisted in 1975 in Murfreesboro with the 2nd North Carolina Continental Line. He marched to Great Bridge. He was at the Battle of Norfolk. He was discharged in 1776. He enlisted in the Independent Seacoast Company, and he was served as a 2nd lieutenant. And he reported that while he was 2nd lieutenant at Ocracoke, he was involved in several skirmishes. He didn't give any details, but he said there were several skirmishes with the British while he was there. In 1780, he was discharged and he was living in Hyde County. And then he enlisted for 9 months and he marched to Kinston. He marched to Kinston. Then he went to the western part of the state and he was involved in the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, which was a huge battle in North Carolina. After that, he returned back to his home in Hyde County, and he enlisted for 3 months as a captain to deal with the Tories that were in Hyde County. Tories were Americans that were still loyal to the British Crown. And so there was basically a civil war going on between the Whigs, the Patriots, and the Tories. It was pretty much a lot of backyard battles. Following the war, he moved to Weakley County, Tennessee, which is what happened to a lot of our veterans because the government didn't have money to pay people for their service, so they gave them land bounties. And most of it was in Tennessee. And if you served any appreciable time within the Army, you could get 600 acres in Tennessee. So a lot of people saw that as an opportunity to move on. So a whole lot of our veterans left this area following the war to claim their bounty lands. The second one is Jacob Beasley. Again, he's from Currituck. He's a resident of Currituck County. And in 1778, at the age of 16, he enlisted in the militia. He was on Captain Burchill Daniels' company, and he guarded the coast from Currituck Inlet, which is the Virginia line, all the way to Cape Hatteras. He says in his declaration, and where I get this information from is from Pension Declaration. I should have said that to begin with, but as time went by after the American Revolution, Congress granted more and more pension benefits to men that had served in the war. So by 1832, they had opened it up to, if you had 6 months service in the militia, you'd be qualified for a federal pension. And so a lot of men that were still survivors in 1832 went to court. You had to appear in open court. And those were not the days where you had any identification. You didn't have a driver's license. You didn't have a passport. You didn't have anything. And if you didn't have a discharge paper, most men were issued discharge paper, but 99% of these men were illiterate. They folded it up, put it in their pocket, and that's the last time they ever saw it. Some of them said, well, I took it home and gave it to my mother, and she put it in the family Bible, and the house burned down 3 years later. So hardly anybody had a discharge paper. So you had to appear in open court, and you had to basically tell what stories you could tell about your service in the American Revolution, who your officers were, where you were stationed, the dates you enlisted, people that you knew that could testify that, yeah, I saw Joe Blow, I saw him over there, when we were in Salisbury or something like that. So you had, that was what you had to go through in order to qualify for a pension. Well, that's just a treasure trove of information because you're just getting firsthand accounts of people that are telling their story. And most of these guys by this time are in their 70s and 80s. So they're pretty old. They got their memories like mine. It's getting a little weak, but I think some of this stuff was pretty vivid. So anyway, he says he was involved in at least 10 to 12 skirmishes and captured several British vessels while he was in the sea, guarding the seacoast. He related one incident where an armed British vessel entered the Sound, Albemarle Sound, went all the way up to Edenton, captured 2 vessels in the harbor there at Edenton, and then came back out the Sound. They commandeered a boat somehow, or several boats, and they met them off the mouth of the Alligator River in Albemarle Sound, and they captured the British ship and they recaptured the 2 American ships that the British had taken as prizes. And he had one other account where he said that up on the North River, they forced a British vessel, which had been in the Sound. They gave chase to it and they forced it to run aground, and they took possession of the British vessel. Beasley remained in service all the way through till the end of the war. Edmund Love, he was born in Pasquotank County in 1760, but he moved to Currituck as a young man. He was in 1775. He enlisted with the 2nd North Carolina in Edenton. He went to Great Bridge in Norfolk, which is, you see most of these guys, that's kind of a pattern they have. In May of 76, he enlisted in the Independent Seacoast Company, and he was stationed at Currituck Inlet for 12 months under Captain Dennis Doge. He then enlisted in the 10th Virginia as a substitute. Now, in the Revolutionary War, if you were drafted or you were called into service, like in the militia or in state's troops, you could hire a substitute to take your place. I saw cases where one brother would serve as a substitute for a younger brother because they didn't think his younger brother was physically able to do it. I saw cases where sons volunteered and substituted for their fathers because the father was needed at home, to take care of the farm and take care of the family. So, and some people substituted for money. They just got paid. Somebody paid them to say, take my place. So that happened quite a bit. So he ended up going all the way up to Pennsylvania and into New Jersey, and he fought at the Battle of Trenton, Brandywine, Schuylkill, and Monmouth, and he was discharged after 18 months service. He came back into North Carolina, and he enlisted in Edgecombe County Militia again as a substitute. So I got a feeling Edmund Lowe was getting paid to be a substitute, and he served 8 weeks there before he was discharged. He moved to Rhea County, Tennessee, and he died in 1837. Samuel Maines was another Currituck County man. He pretty much followed the same schedule. He enlisted in the 2nd North Carolina for 6 months. He was at Great Bridge and at Norfolk. In late 1776, he enlisted for 9 months under the coastal defense with Captain Doge, and he was discharged in May of 1777. He enlisted for 3 years with the 10th North Carolina, and he marched to join General Washington in Philadelphia. He was at the Battle of Monmouth, where he was promoted to corporal, and then he returned to North Carolina and marched all the way down to Charleston, where he was taken as a prisoner of war when the city of Charleston was surrendered by the Patriot General Lincoln. He was finally paroled, and he returned to Currituck County. But that's a lot of walking. I mean, they're not riding buses, they're not riding in wagons, they're not getting on a plane. These guys are walking. They're marching from Philadelphia to Charleston. That's a pretty good hike. Joshua Farrow, he was born in Currituck County in 1757. He volunteered in the Currituck County Militia. Like the others, he was at the Battle of Great Bridge. Colonel Samuel Jarvis, who was the colonel of the Currituck County Militia, called out the militia to help defend New Bern. And so he spent 2 months down at New Bern after the battles of Norfolk and Great Bridge. And then after that, he was sent to Cape Hatteras, where he spent 2 months at Cape Hatteras. And then he volunteered to serve with Doge on the rest of the coastline. In 1779, he was drafted as a sergeant for 6 months service to reinforce the troops at Charleston. His enlistment expired just before Charleston fell, and he was able to return to Currituck County. And following the war, he moved to Richmond County, Georgia. The last fella is Israel Pierce. He was a Terrell County man. He was a free man of color, so he could enlist in the Army. He enlisted for 1 year naval service at Ocracoke Inlet. He was on board the ship, the Caswell, which mounted 36 guns and was stationed off Ocracoke Inlet to prevent the privateering that we talked about earlier with people like Goodrich that were coming down and just laying for weight at Currituck Inlet. So they mounted the Caswell stayed off Ocracoke Inlet for much of the war. Following his naval service, he enlisted in North Carolina Continental Line. He was there at the Siege of Charleston. He was at the Battle of Hanging Rock. And then he was at the Battle of Eutaw Springs. And following the war, he moved from Terrell County to Beaufort County. And this was a letter, I just threw this in as an example. This was a letter that was sent from Colonel Gideon Lamb, who was a Continental Line officer stationed at Edenton. He was basically a recruiting officer there, to General Sumner, who was the general of the North Carolina Brigade. And it's just kind of matter of fact the way he wrote this thing. You know, like last Tuesday, small ship Rick Galley, which means that they could row it, came into Currituck Inlet, burned a small sloop, passed into the Sound, they took another schooner, carried it down the Sound and burned her. And it was like this kind of thing was just happening on a regular basis. He didn't seem too alarmed by it. And the chain of events that will unfold eventually is that on November 21st, 1776, the southernmost independent seacoast company is disbanded. And I think we'll see why in just a minute. Captain Selby Harney is relieved of command. A fellow by the name of Seth Harvey. Captain Seth Harvey takes his place. On November the 27th, only 6 days later, the North Carolina raises 3 more Continental Line troops, Continental Line regiments. So they now have the 7th, 8th, and 9th Regiment. Harney resigned, was relieved from command so that he could be appointed major of the 8th North Carolina. So he left the naval service and basically joined the Continental Line here. And by the fall, end of 1777, all the seacoast companies are disbanded. North Carolina can no longer keep them up. And the Continental establishment's not going to take them over, so they abandoned the whole independent seacoast company concept. So the defense of the seacoast then, in our case, along the northern Outer Banks, falls to the militia. It's up to the militia then to protect the coast. And that would, in our area, those days, that was all Currituck County. So it falls to Colonel Samuel Jarvis. He was appointed colonel of the militia in September 75. He served with paymaster and commissary for Captain Dozier. In 1780, the governor organized 2 regiments of state's troops. He was in command of the 1st. They marched to Camden, South Carolina, and he was engaged in the Battle of Camden there. And he had not only that, he had a very active political career. He represented Currituck County in many of the state assemblies and governments, the Provincial Congress and the Senate at the time. He was a very well-liked man. Most of the accounts that I read of men that served under him referred to him as the beloved colonel. So I think he was highly regarded, and I think people had high opinion of him. But the responsibility to prevent British invasion now along the Currituck Outer Banks falls to Colonel Samuel Jarvis. I'm going to just briefly go through 3 or 4 guys that I thought would be of interest. These are guys that served in the militia under Jarvis, and just give you a brief account of what they said they did. This was 11 Balance. He was from Currituck County. He said that in 1782, the militia captured a British galley that had entered Currituck Sound. John Grant reported on British tenders entering the Sound and raiding houses, farms, burning boats, and killing livestock. Jesse Perry, we talked about the skirmish at Roanoke Inlet. Jesse Perry said he was involved in 2 skirmishes at Nag's Head from British landing parties during his career. Bartholomew Thompson, he stated that in 1780 there was a British invasion into Currituck County, and they came as far as Tulls Creek Bridge. If any of you know where Tulls Creek Bridge is, it's just a little bit east of Sligo. You go up that way. And then the last guy is a fellow by the name of Nicholas Perry. And I thought he was a kind of an interesting character. He's actually from Hertford County. He was drafted for 5 months service in the Hertford County militia. He went to Fayetteville and then to Augusta, Georgia. He was at the Battle of Briar Creek, which was a real disaster. for the North Carolina troops that were there. Briar Creek was on the south side of the Savannah River, and we were soundly defeated by the British. He discharged and returned to Hertford County. He wasn't captured or killed. Then he volunteered for 3 months again in the militia, and the militia was assigned from Hertford County to come to Currituck to help out with guarding the coast. So Jarvis was getting some help from some of these other counties as they came along, as they needed it. But he said they had a difficult time getting here because the British troops and the Tories had raided farms, burned buildings, chopped down orchards. They had destroyed a lot of bridges and a lot of transportation. He said at Tolls Creek, the bridge had been burned and had been destroyed. And when they got there, they had to take their baggage over on canoes. And he said they swam the horses because they must have been mounted to come from Hertford County. Maybe they swam their horses across the creek. And so they stayed there for a short while. Then they returned. They were ordered to Suffolk, Virginia. And by the time they got to Suffolk, the British had burned the town of Suffolk. So Suffolk was in ruins. So they basically then returned to Hertford County. Colonel Selby Harney, we talked about him earlier. He was raised to the rank of major. Following the Battle of Germantown, he was promoted to lieutenant colonel. He was wounded and taken prisoner at the siege of Charleston. He had a real difficult time. He'd been shot in the hip, and he couldn't rejoin the army until he was fully recovered. And it took him over a year to get to where he could even get out of bed. He was exchanged on June the 14th, 1781. He was promoted, brevet promotion to colonel. He was elected to the legislature here in Pasquotank County. And like so many, he moved to Tennessee, and he died in Tennessee. But he's buried right here behind the museum in the old Episcopal Cemetery. His grave is old. That's where this photograph is. This photograph's taken. Let me give you that. This is where he's buried. He's buried right here behind us, not very far. On June the 30th, 1779, the Council of State, we had gone from Provincial Congress to Council of State by that point in time, authorized the reestablishment of the Ocracoke Independent Seacoast Company, and that would stay in effect through the end of the war. And that was led by Captain Adam Gaskell. So there would be troops stationed at Ocracoke Inlet throughout the remainder of the war. I hope you've had in this brief presentation, you can see the role that the local militias played in preventing these coastal raids and destruction of property by the inhabitants. I think the Independent Seacoast Company and defense of the coast is an important part of our heritage here in the Albemarle region, and it's largely been overlooked and forgotten about until I started digging into this. That's the only way I found out about it, but I think it's a fascinating part of our local history. Any questions?
Percentage of people tourists?
That's a good question. But a lot of Tories left. Early in the war, a lot of Tories left and went to Nova Scotia, places like that, along the coast. And a lot of the fighting that we had with Tories were not local Tories. For example, in South Carolina, Francis Marion, in some of his accounts, he had a lot of dealing with fighting Tories in South Carolina. And he stated that most all those guys were from New York, that they were part of what they called the Queen's Regiment. They were Americans that enlisted in the British Army, but they wouldn't put them in the regular army. They had special Tory units that they put them in. And so there was a lot of Tories here that weren't necessarily, it was more of a Tory militia, I guess is what I'm saying. But I don't know what percent actually left this area or involved. But you know, they were really harsh Tories. I mean, you got your property was confiscated. It was sold to finance North Carolina's war effort. Most people left. The militia was not kind to Tories. If they called a Tory, the militia considered that if you raised arms against the local militia, it was a capital offense, and you'd be executed. And so there was a lot of bad blood between both sides. Any other questions?
The average age, I mean, I'm looking at this tombstone and this guy is only 50 years old when he passed away.
He was a full colonel.
Yeah.
I mean, most of the guys in the militia were young.
Mhm.
Here's what would happen in the militia. And the militia was kind of the first stepping stone to go to the Continental Line. A lot of guys go to the militia, then go to the Continental Line. If the militia could not raise enough men, they'd be given a quota. The brigadier general of the Eaton's military district go to each county and say, I need 23 men for your county. The militia would gather together volunteers. Some people would raise their hands, step forward. The deficit would be drafted, and they would be drafted by being voted on by the militia. The militia would vote on who goes. And so they tended to be young guys that had no responsibility. That's who they tended to draft.
If you get drafted that way, you could substitute.
If you had money enough to hire a substitute, you could hire a substitute. But not many of these guys had any money. And some of the guys enlisted because they thought it was a big adventure, you know, a chance to do something different. And if you were not the firstborn son, you didn't have any reason to hang around this part of the country because anything that you might inherit is going to your older brother. So a lot of these guys, this is a good chance to do something different. There's a lot of camaraderie in the American ranks. This question is always asked, why did these guys stay, particularly in the Continental Line, when they were so far from home? Why did these guys stay in the Army when they weren't paid, they weren't fed, and they were barely clothed? And the only thing is, it was just they had a sense of purpose. They had a camaraderie that they kind of stayed together. That's the only thing that kept them together because they certainly didn't get any benefits out of it.
You mentioned that the Continental Line went to New York, up as far north as New York. It didn't go beyond that into New England.
Oh, they may have. Most of our guys only went to New York. The farthest north that we had, in fact, the 7th North Carolina Regiment of the Continental Line was stationed at West Point on the Hudson River. And in those days, they called it the North River. That's what we call the Hudson today. And they were charged with, it was Colonel James Hogan out of Martin County, Halifax County line. He let him up there. And he was charged with building fortifications at West Point overlooking the Hudson River so they could stop any kind of British naval incursion up the Hudson. And so he laid the foundation for what would be the West Point Military Academy. Because that's where the West Point Military Academy is built. It's where he erected those first fortifications there. And they were a lot of North Carolina men that did it. So that's about as far as I could find any. There's a few that crossed. There's some men that were stationed at White Plains, New York, which is basically outside of New York City. But I couldn't find any further north. Any other questions?
Thank you so much. Excellent briefing. Thank you. I'm somewhat of a history buff, right? It wouldn't be, you're probably like all of us. You're right. I never heard of this story, so thank you for bringing this to my attention. Thank you.
It's pretty fascinating. It's been largely forgotten.
Yeah.
So you're gonna take this and turn it into another one of your books?
Well, I am. I'm in the process. I tell you, when I got started on this in preparation for the 250th, my wife, who's also kind of a history nut, she said, we need to do something for the 250th celebration. Do you think you can find some veterans that served in this area? And I said, well, I think I'll try. So I got tuned in on these pension records. And I spent, hours and hours and hours reading because they're all handwritten. It's not typed. It's all a clerk of a court that wrote it back in 1832. And every county has a different handwriting. So it's not like, it's all different. Some you can read, some it's very difficult to read. So anyway, I've gone through a bunch of these and most all of our counties, and I've gone through them, and I must have 200 or 300 people. And so I'm trying to figure out what to do with all this information. I may end up putting it in some kind of a book form. I'm not sure.
These handwritten records that you were reading, were they using the F's for S's in the middle?
Yes, they were. Yes, they were. Even as late as that. Now, and the other thing that was interesting in these pensions is that the Congress in 1818 passed a hardship law that if you were a if you had served in the Continental Line and you were in what they called reduced circumstances, that you could apply for a hardship pension. And so it was fascinating to read these hardship pensions because they had to list their assets. And you think about what you've got today, you think about what some of these people had in 1818, they had nothing. I mean, a big thing was to say, I had a Dutch oven, or I've got a spider, a frying pan. And some of these guys had absolutely nothing. Just the way of life in those days. But you had to prove that you had to list all your assets, and then you had to have other people, and usually it was a preacher or somebody in the local area would say, yeah, I've known him for so and so, and he's extremely poor, he's on hard times, and he really needs the help of the government to get by.
List how many pairs of pants you have as your assets.
Well, that's right. I mean, they got down to where I had 3 forks, I had 2 spoons, I got a Dutch oven, and I got a table. And that was all some of these people had. It's just amazing. So I'm gonna try to include that as well if I ever pull all the stuff together. Just the hardship pensions alone. And some of these people were and I was amazed at the number of people that had taken on other children. Some of these guys would say, I've got 2 kids living with us that aren't mine that we've taken over. And I need help, in raising these kids because I don't have any money now. I've got, my health has gone bad, or some of the guys were shoe cobblers and they couldn't see anymore. They'd lost their eyesight, their vision. And so, but a lot of these people had taken on or had adopted, informally adopted other children in the neighborhood. They were trying to raise them and they needed some help. They couldn't do it anymore. Most of these pensions were like $8 a month.
It was a lot.
They got them by. It's not like they got a lot of money, but they most of them that were, and some guys were rejected. I mean, you have to run across a lot of where they were rejected. If you didn't have sufficient proof of who you were and your service, the War Department would stamp it rejected and send it back. You would get in. So it was a difficult task for some of these guys to verify their service and their need. Thank you very much. No, appreciate you having me.